Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is December 15th, 2022, and it is my pleasure to have with me today investigative journalist David Armiak. David is research director with the Center for Media and Democracy, which he joined in 2015. In this capacity, he has conducted extensive investigations on dark money, corporate corruption, and right-wing networks, and he is responsible for filing and analyzing hundreds of public records requests every year. He has a strong research interest in social movements and political power and has delivered many talks on that subject. David has a bachelor's degree in philosophy and anthropology from Boston University and a master's degree in anthropology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And you can follow David on Twitter and it's @DUBOO. And you can follow his work at CMD's website, which is exposedbycmd, all one word, .org. So David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
And you're joining us from Wisconsin, right?
Yep. It's a very snowy day here. The city has shut down after a snowstorm came through last night.
Well, I mean, I'm in DC where we shut down when there is like the tiniest drop of ice or snow. So I'm sure you all laugh at us. Well, yeah. I think this is the first podcast I've done with someone sitting in Wisconsin. So that alone is pretty cool. But I'm very excited. I've been wanting to have you on the podcast pretty much ever since I discovered you and your work. Just to offer some quick context for people who are joining us on why we're doing a podcast today with someone who's an expert on dark money and all that stuff. So I want to just talk for a second about the nexus between Palestine work and ESG, socially responsible investing. So there is a growing movement in the United States that seeks to delegitimize and penalize investors who consider environmental, social, and governance, just ESG, issues when allocating their clients' money. For Republican politicians leading this effort, this has basically become an all-purpose rallying cry in the partisan culture wars about woke capitalism. And in effect, we are now hearing the phrase, which is that ESG is the new CRT, with potentially far-reaching and damaging implications for people who do work focused remotely on anything related to E, S, or G. So why we're here today, Israel has become a key issue and a powerful weapon or vector in the campaign against ESG. And we have officials and elected officials and politicians from both parties who are attacking investors, investment analysts, data providers for carrying out ESG assessments that dare to subject Israel to the same legal and normative standards as other countries, including on international law, human rights, because when you subject Israel to the same standards as everybody else, Israel doesn't necessarily score all that well. And the argument then effectively is made that the standards are the problem and the standards must be intrinsically anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, and therefore the standards have to be changed or special exceptions have to be carved out for Israel. So that's what we're dealing with. And for folks who want to learn more about that specific piece of it, I want to recommend the two recent podcasts I've done on that topic, one featuring world-renowned documentary filmmaker Julia Basha, and that one was entitled, I apologize for the terrible title, Free Speech and Palestinian Rights, Weapons and Targets in the Battle Against ESG. And the other one, which I did 10 days ago, I think, with Tara Van Ho, who is the international legal expert in business and human rights. That one was entitled Promoting Risk and Undermining Rights, Morningstar's Betrayal of Palestine and ESG. And I'll throw links to both of those into the notes accompanying this podcast. So what we're talking about today is another key aspect of this battle. And it's both the battle against Israel and activism on Israel and the battle against ESG, which are linked. And that is the role of the American Legislative Exchange Council, aka ALEC. I always forget what ALEC stands for because no one ever uses the whole name. But it's the role of ALEC in drafting, promulgating, and promoting legislation in US states targeting values-based protest and grassroots activism. And David arguably knows more about this than anyone in the world outside of ALEC, and maybe even knows more about this than some people inside ALEC, about these legislative efforts. And again, these are efforts that in the first instance, and we're going to talk about ALEC, targeted Palestine-related protest and free speech, but today have evolved into ALEC-backed legislation targeting the protest and free speech writ large, focused on any industry or group that might that the state might want to protect for its own reasons, in the fight against woke capitalism. So let's just dive right in. And I'm really excited because this is something which is quite opaque, I think, to almost all of us. And I'm really interested in hearing from you, David. So let you talk. First question, can you give all of us some background on ALEC? What is it? Where did it come from? Who is it? And what are its objectives? And maybe this is a lot of questions, but wrapping it up, where does its funding come from? Because it's clearly a well-funded organization.
Sure. Again, thank you so much for having me. It's really wonderful to be here. This is a very important issue, and it's going to become even more of an important issue, next year and in 2024. ALEC is a pay-to-play organization that brings together corporate lobbyists and state lawmakers a couple times a year at fancy resorts, usually 4- or 5-star resorts, where they can bring their families and whatnot to meet behind closed doors without the public's involvement to draft, discuss, debate model policies. And then in separate, what they call task forces, they together vote as equals. So the corporate lobbyists and the state lawmakers have equal votes on the model legislation. And so, the BDS bill, went through this process, the ESG bills that you had mentioned went through this process. And then once those become, so-called models, then the lawmakers take those bills that, are absent of a state name or a sponsor name, take them back to their state houses and introduce them for passage, right? So why is this problematic? The constituents of these elected officials are not part of this process. And increasingly, we've seen state legislatures meeting, for less time, or their staff are defunded, or their offices are defunded. And so ALEC has moved in to provide supporting services, research, along with its sister organization, the State Policy Network, which is a right-wing network of think tanks in every state that show up to provide, so-called academic legitimacy for these bills when they show up in state houses. And so ALEC sort of helps, these lawmakers, the vast majority of which are Republicans, to move model legislation that it feels is important. Right. And oftentimes this is legislation that corporations want. However, in the last 5 or 6 years, mainly since, the arrival of the MAGA movement and Mr. Trump, we've seen a sort of right-wing shift away from, listening, primarily to corporate interests, to listening to the Christian right, and also those that are part of Mr. Trump's movement.
So I guess I just want to just really make this very clear for people who are listening. I mean, I think sometimes people think it's sort of a conspiracy theory to suggest that lobbyists are actually drafting legislation. With the case of ALEC, this is their declared purpose, and they actually publish on their website and circulate model legislation, which is completely written, and it's just fill in the blank, right? Fill in the name of your state, check the boxes for the things that you want to do. And what you're saying essentially is that historically this is focused on, the traditional sort of corporate, I don't know if you want to talk more about what will be traditionally sort of right-wing corporate interests, but we've seen an evolution to what are sort of more of the red meat values from the Christian right. Is that accurate?
Correct. So, a lot of climate, pushback, from the fossil fuel industry, bills, pushing back against state regulations, federal regulations too, for that matter, came through ALEC. Koch Industries has been a major, and the Koch political network have been major sponsors of ALEC over the years and have pushed through a lot of this stuff. we have, an ultimate goal of the right wing to privatize our public education system. So a lot of, charter school chains and private education companies and organizations in the Betsy DeVos network, who was formerly our Secretary of Education under Trump, right? A billionaire from Michigan. Her goal has been, to privatize education, so that, money can move to religious schools, so taxpayer money can go to religious schools and not only for public education. Lowering taxes, right? Keeping healthcare privatized, right? Protecting the interests of the pharmaceutical industry. All of these are examples of, sort of the main foci of ALEC over the years. But lately we've seen, things that are different, right? So like, there's been the Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America, which is one of the major anti-abortion groups in the country, appearing at ALEC and doing at their meeting and doing a kind of a celebration dinner after the Dobbs decision. The Family Research Council, a Christian right group, has circulated anti-gay and anti-trans bills and done workshops at ALEC meetings. We know ALEC has outsourced its work on voter suppression to the dark money group Honest Elections Project, which is a group within the sphere of Leonard Leo, or who's better known as Trump's judge whisperer, that helped move our federal court system, severely to the right. Yeah, I guess I could go on and on, but there's
yeah,
there's a lot of.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that it's really kind of shifted and manifested, and part of the reason is that once ALEC became well known, and I like to think a lot of this has to do with the work that we've done, because over 10 years ago we received a massive whistleblower dump of model bills from ALEC, or from a whistleblower that originated from ALEC, and that's where our ALEC Exposed project came from. We still maintain ALEC Exposed. I encourage people to go there, alecexposed.org. If you're wondering if a bill you see in your state house, where it came from. It's, where was I going with this? So ALEC Exposed, and, these bills, I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
No, I think it's the idea that they become much more open about what they're doing as well. There's much more of a, I would say 10 years ago, none of us had heard of ALEC. Today, ALEC is very publicly the source and the clearinghouse for legislation that reflects the objectives of the political and religious right in this country, which then raises the question, how in the world did Israel and Israel activism get involved in this? So just moving to that, and the main issue today that we're talking about is legislation that is designed and marketed as anti-ESG, anti-woke capitalism. But as we've talked about in these previous podcasts, the precursor, the model for this anti-ESG, anti-woke capitalism is this legislation that's now been adopted in about half of US states, more than half of US states, that's targeting boycotts of Israel and settlements. And we know that this is modeled on the anti-BDS legislation because the people backing the anti-ESG legislation say it's modeled on anti-ESG legislation. But once again, you and your research and looking at, released documents, you can draw a direct line between that and ALEC's position on anti-BDS legislation. So I want to first ask you to talk about why you think, or what you know about ALEC's decision to become involved in what effectively is foreign policy, which is not traditionally part of the corporate set of interests that would be involved here. And specifically, when and how and why are they in the business of legislating on Israel?
This was quite a mystery to me until I watched the movie Boycott. And so, perhaps, the director or filmmakers would be better to answer this question. But, my understanding is that ALEC really became interested in this through, the Israeli lobby and the connection with, white Christian nationalism in the US, and that these joint forces together helped to kind of push the BDS model bill into ALEC and out through ALEC. Although I will say that you will not find that bill on the ALEC site. And they have distanced themselves and removed, much of any reference to it from their sites. But definitely, it was there. We have a letter from then Chairman Leah Vukmir, who, was from Wisconsin at the time, pushing this bill right around the time when we saw the bill introduced here in Wisconsin and moved through the State House. But it definitely is, a good question. Again, I'll go back to the fact that ALEC is a pay-to-play organization. So they're up for the highest bidders. So it's definitely plausible that ALEC received some sort of money, from the Israeli lobby in order to pass this bill. Now, how exactly? I do not know. I've been trying to work on that. Why? Because we're seeing other countries exerting their influence through ALEC now. Taiwan suddenly has become a country that ALEC has championed over the last couple of meetings. Moldova, another country, they recently introduced a resolution on. And this is a group that's supposed to be focused on state issues and federalism, state rights. So it's really quite interesting and hard to understand when you look at their stated principles. But if you know that ALEC is a pay-to-play organization, then you can jump to the conclusion that they must be receiving money from these foreign countries somehow.
Right. I would also add, if people look on the ALEC website, you can find a press release from December 2018 entitled "ALEC Legislators Sign Letter to Reiterate Commitment to Free Market Against Discriminatory Policies," which states outright, ALEC legislators have been a key part of the federal government's efforts to halt BDS groups from using commercial discrimination and intimidation to coerce companies into ignoring the benefits of free market relations with Israel. And it goes on to quote what was then the incoming ALEC chairman, Alan Clemens, who is a former state lawmaker from, I believe, South Carolina, who was South Carolina was the first state to adopt anti-BDS legislation. And Clemens is on the record as being one of the key promoters. He's actually been feted by the Israelis for his work around anti-BDS legislation. So it's not simply we think there's a tie. There's actual documents making clear there is a tie. So
yeah, and actually we connected him in a story for The Guardian with Joseph Sabag. I apologize if I'm butchering his name.
Joseph Sabag.
Yeah. So he's featured in that boycott film as the one sort of behind the scenes moving this BDS bill, right? We got communications from Florida between him and Randy Fine about redefining anti-Semitism on campuses and trying to prevent Palestinian groups and whatnot from operating on campuses there.
Yeah, and I'll put a link to that communication, which I've actually cited in my own writing. It's really important, I think, as we're talking about this, to make clear this isn't just about attributing intent or guessing at the linkages. The people a lot of the people involved are openly bragging about what they're doing. They're very proud of it. So it's important to make those connections where they are.
It's funny too, because when the Guardian's Ed Pilkington reached out to them to ask them about it, and say, why is ALEC engaged in this? He got the typical response that said, "Oh, it wasn't ALEC. This was just some friends meeting." Well, ALEC often says this. They have the huge hotel. They rent out the whole hotel, and then they provide meeting rooms for all these groups to meet with the lawmakers, including lobbyists, but also a lot of right-wing groups. Including Israeli groups. So it's not unusual. It's a talking point that we've seen over and over again. But when they feel comfortable, they'll come out. And again, I'll refer back to the Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America example. In the past, those were emails that they had the so-called pro-life breakfasts at every annual meeting that they invited lawmakers to. That was not publicized. It was not on the agenda, but we saw the communications through open records requests time and time again. It was not until after Dobbs that they came out and were celebratory and it was on the agenda.
Right.
So I would, like you, I would refer, folks to look at the records, look what's there, Look at the community.
Believe them in their own words, that they're telling you what they're doing. I will add, just as an aside, one of the things that when I started really digging into ALEC's role on anti-BDS legislation, one thing that was striking to me is that the anti-BDS legislation actually conflicts with ALEC's other arguments, which are basically that no non-financial, non-fiduciary consideration should be taken into account in any policies regarding investment or contracts. And effectively with the anti-BDS legislation, they're saying that in the name of, free market, we are actually demanding that you take into account a non-financial, non-fiduciary element, which is how this company treats Israel and settlements. It's absolutely hypocritical, which actually turns out to be a little bit funny as we get into the metastasizing legislation, which would seem to actually punish them if they implement their own anti-BDS legislation. But that's way down in the weeds. I want to come back a little bit higher up. So. Okay. Back in 2018, I wrote an article where I put on my Cassandra hat. I warned that this anti-BDS legislation, which we really should be calling anti-boycott legislation, because it's about boycotts of settlements or Israel. It's not about, the BDS movement. It's not just about boycotting Israel. It's about boycotting Israel or settlements. And by boycotting, we mean even making a distinction between Israel and settlements. I warned that this would become a template almost inevitably for legislation targeting literally anything else that people wanted to protest if the state wanted to block it. And for people who don't follow this closely, I think just to lay out, the logic of these laws holds in effect that fine, you can have your free speech as an American, fine and dandy, but if you are earning taxpayer money via contracts, via employment, via procurements, or if you are getting taxpayer money invested in you, then the taxpayer shouldn't be supporting things that the government doesn't like, because the government is acting as a steward of taxpayer will, and that would be violating the will of taxpayers. So basically, your free speech doesn't extend to the right to actually be employed or procure from or be invested in with taxpayer money, which really does sound to most of us like an unconstitutional condition under, giving up free speech in order to do business with governments, but that's, within the courts to decide. But regardless, that was like a clear template, right, for anything that the state might want to protect. And that prediction started to come true last year in 2021. We started to see, as you've talked about, ALEC's focused on climate change. We started to see legislation targeting climate change, fossil fuel industry, so protecting them from pressure, and protecting the guns and ammunition industry from pressure. And then in 2022, we saw an explosion of these bills, and we saw a couple of what I would call like tentative test bills that broadened it to basically the entire list of industries. I'll put a link in the notes to my table tracking all of this. So that was me. Back in February 22, you actually published an article drawing a direct line between ALEC and these laws that I was tracking, particularly the ones focused on the fossil fuel industry. You wrote an article entitled "ALEC's Critical Energy Theory Bills Moving in 4 States." So can you talk about that the place where the anti-BDS legislation as a model came together, what you're seeing, that coming together as a template, what was initially going after the critical energy theory, which is protecting the fossil fuel industry?
Yeah, so back in the summer of 2021, ALEC at its annual meeting introduced the Energy Discrimination Elimination Act, which was, basically a bill, as you said, modeled on BDS to protect fossil fuel interests. That bill, for some reason did not pass at that meeting, but we became aware of it. And at the December 2021 meeting, which they call the States and Nation Policy Summit, it was introduced again. And Jason Isaac, who runs Life Powered out of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is a right-wing think tank, a member of the State Policy Network, which I mentioned before, very well funded. It receives a lot of Koch money, Koch meaning, Koch Industries, and other fossil fuel interest money. And the morning of that meeting, an email was sent out to all the members of the Energy, Environment, and Agricultural Task Force that was considering the bill, said, that this bill is based on BDS. So it's a bill that ALEC had passed, and you should pass it because, this is going to hurt, American energy, and it's going to hurt our economy. It passed unanimously. So we, did a story on it. We worked with Kate Aronoff at the New Republic, which she came up with the critical energy theory, a great coin term for this. And we began to track, right? We were able to obtain through open records requests a list of all those who attended the meeting, that Energy, Environment, and Agricultural Task Force meeting. And so then we looked at where the bills had passed and where they were introduced, and we were able to draw, between sponsors or core sponsors, for these different bills in these states with, that list at ALEC. So it was very clear that, the ALEC, legislative members were following, rank and file to get these bills moving.
Right. And I'll also put a link to that email, which again is someone from within the ALEC family drawing the direct line between the critical energy theory bills and the anti-BDS bills.
Yeah, and he actually did it again at this last meeting in December, where they introduced a wider version of the bill, which actually, said, to protect not only fossil fuels, but agriculture, logging, and then, like, in parentheses, anything else your state feels is important.
Right. That's what I want to ask you about. So I want to fast forward to earlier this month. I've got to say it's fascinating listening to you, because I feel like I am a practitioner who is looking at what's happening from the outside and I can explain what's happening and try to diagnose exactly how it's happening, but you've got the actual x-rays, right? You've got the x-rays and the blood tests. It's fascinating. So fast forwarding from 2021 to early last month, you broke the news that ALEC's, I guess basically November, you broke the news that they were doubling down in the attack on ESG and woke capitalism. You found the draft text of a bill of a model text on their website, which none of us had seen at that point, which was really exciting because it validated what people like you and I knew was coming based on what we were seeing introduced at the state legislatures. It actually looks very much like legislation that was introduced in 2022 in Idaho, and I want to say Minnesota, with this broad, timber, lumber, commercial agriculture, guns and ammunition. They're waiting for someone to protect the Pee Wee golf stuff. So you wrote an article entitled "ALEC Eyes Sweeping Government Blacklists," and it's important to note blacklists because that's what this is about. And you followed up with a piece last week following your own coverage of the meeting in Washington of ALEC. I'd love to hear you talk about, which was entitled "ALEC Doubles Down on Punishing ESG Firms." So can you tell us what ALEC is up to with all this? They had the meeting, they adopted this model legislation. What is the game plan as you understand it from documents you've been able to unearth and from what you saw with the meeting in Washington at the beginning of December? And again, how does this relate to its position on legislation targeting boycotts of Israel and settlements?
Okay, there was a lot in those questions, so if I don't address everything, then please follow up. So yeah, we ALEC posed all of its drafts way before the meeting for lawmakers to consider. We were able to catch this bill on there that is a wider form of the original Energy Discrimination Elimination Act. Like I'd said, in parentheses, it said any industry. It's funny that you mentioned gun manufacturers, showing up in Idaho, and I forget what other state you said. But ALEC, ever since it was tied to the murder of Trayvon Martin, with its Castle Doctrine model bill, has done everything in its power to distance themselves from guns because it lost so much corporate support. Between our ALEC Exposed investigation now, they've lost almost 120 corporations who've publicly dropped out. So they've really, at any time that guns might come into a conversation or whatnot, they've tried to just eliminate it, like silence it. So I had thought when I saw that originally, this must be that opening for guns, so that they don't have to say it, right? Anyways, so back to the bill. So yeah, so we saw that this bill came. What was interesting, not only was very broad in strokes and allowed for blacklists. It empowered AGs to investigate, right? And looking at all kinds of things that corporations produce. You're really questioning, how supportive, citizenry of these states where these bills might be introduced would want to be in this process, given the resources that will be needed to look at these firms. And then when you see the bill, appear, and as it's debated at the meeting, we found no evidence at all that any corporations were pushing this. Again, Jason Isaac, he sends an email, almost the same. In fact, he forgot to change one of the headings in the email. It still said Energy Discrimination Elimination Act. I had to look at it twice or 3 times. I'm like, wait a second, he's talking about the new bill.
If I could just interject, it's fascinating. I had noticed at the time with the Minnesota and Idaho bills, when they listed all the industries, at the time I noticed they left off the guns and ammunition industry. I'd forgotten that. And now looking at them again, and the model bill that is adopted by ALEC, you're right. It leaves off most of the legislation we saw in 2022 and 21 was fossil fuel industry and guns and ammunition. This effort leaves off guns and ammunition. That is a fascinating insight that I had missed. And I want to put it there for the record that ALEC's legislation doesn't include that.
Right. Yeah, so the bill, is considered in two task forces, Energy, Environment, and Agriculture Task Force. Again, it kind of moves through that task force smoothly. And then in the Commerce Task Force, apparently the private sector members, there was some issues. I don't have specifics on this, but they had to do a different kind of roll call vote. And it did pass, but we're still investigating, trying to see if we can uncover more information to that. So we do know that this broader bill has passed, and so we can now expect to see this, roll out in many states next year. ESG was center stage at this December meeting. The first opening breakfast featured Consumers Research Will Hild, which is a dark money group that is connected to the Leonard Leo network, and has been at the forefront of this. Maybe you've seen some of their attacks against BlackRock. They have all kinds of ad campaigns online, and sometimes in cities they'll do like billboards or digital billboards on trucks and things, targeting BlackRock CEO Larry Fink. But anyway, so he was there with the financial officer from Florida and the state treasurer, and they had a conversation about ESGs and why, and trying to drumbeat why this is an issue and why, states seem to care or need to care, right? Basically manufacturing a crisis that's not there. Immediately following this, there was a workshop on ESG. That workshop was incredibly well attended. There were no seats. A lot of people were standing in there. It again featured Consumers Research Will Hild, Heritage Action's Jessica Anderson, and Andy Puzder, the former Carl's Jr. Fast food tycoon, who now is a senior fellow at Heritage working on this issue. We know, through our research and through open records requests that Puzder has been involved. And through some other intelligence that Puzder is involved in writing all of these bills that we've seen. And we didn't mention. Sorry, if I can back up for a second. So in the spring, in what was it, March or April, ALEC held a task force meeting out of schedule for its tax task force to pass a bill relating a model legislation relating to pensions to try to prevent ESG investing in public pensions. This was a bill
which also matches the anti-BDS efforts, which is to essentially divest from and prevent investment in funds that do not abide by the rules that have been laid down.
Correct.
One time it's not a profit motive.
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we address that.
Yeah.
And so at this workshop, Puzder, called ESG, wolf, or what do you call it? Yeah, socialism and a wolf in sheep's clothing, something to that effect, saying, you know, this is the fight, ESG is the fight of this generation, like communism before, like fighting the Nazis before that. I mean, really just, you know, dramatic speech, you know, had people, you know, laughing and clapping. Will Hild, you know, was less dramatic, but offered, you know, strategies on how to fight, you know, or encouraging people to work, you know, with state AGs and state treasurers. Of course, the ALEC aligned and ALEC modeled group, the State Financial Officers Foundation, has been an extremely important organization in this fight. They've been leading a lot of efforts, and where we've seen the states pass these bills, they've been instrumental in getting them passed, right? There, you know, probably folks have seen reporting of treasurers, you know, taking money out of BlackRock specifically. You know, this has been in the news quite a bit lately. You know, so Hild was offering, you know, that advice. He also offered, you know, advice to the lawmakers to look at their committees and what types of powers they have to subpoena or investigate these firms on their own. Today, as we speak in Texas, ALEC member and Texas State Senator Brian Hughes is leading an inquiry or public hearing, sorry, into this ESG investing, and has subpoenaed a number of organizations, including BlackRock. He excused Vanguard, which recently dropped out of net zero. So, you know, it kind of showing you, you know, what their goals are here. So Hild offered these, sort of tutorials, and then Jessica Anderson offered the help of Heritage Foundation. You know, she said, you know, we've got 10 lobbyists across the country that can help you. We can help with, you know, dealing with the opposition. We can help you to get these bills passed. We expect already to see these in 20 states, or up to 20 states, sorry. And, you know, passed out a flyer. They have a project site called ESG Hurts. And so she was really promoting that as well. 2 models on there, very similar to the ALEC model bills. And so, yeah, it was very well attended. And so we, you know, should expect to see, you know, right away, you know, these bills popping up in the legislative session here in January. I know Missouri already has one pre-filed. Idaho's been trying to move something.
Ohio, I believe, as well has a pre-filed.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. So, and for folks who are interested in tracking this, I have a database. I check this pretty obsessively and just post it. It's, you know, maybe you think this is a great idea and you want to follow it closely. Maybe you think it's bad. Either way, the data is what the data is, and you know, I will put a link to that in the comments. So I want to ask you, in terms of where you think this is going to go, the anti-boycott bills. Or the anti-Israel boycott bills enjoyed an odd and maybe, I don't know if it's unique status, right? So these are arguably things that you would not have expected progressives to get behind, right? It's challenging free speech in a way which is pretty amazing. But progressives largely support in state legislatures generally either supported it or didn't oppose it because it was framed as the pro-Israel position. Or in some cases that we saw in the boycott movie, they just didn't pay sufficient attention to realize what was going on, which is just, you know, bad legislating. But regardless, you didn't see the kind of objections you would have expected from people who defend the right to protest, the right to free speech, because of the Israel issue being embedded in this. And for folks who are following this closely, we've had multiple court cases challenging the anti-BDS legislation. Those cases have been mixed bag in terms of success. Largely, courts have found them to be likely unconstitutional. But what's happened then as a result is the backers of these bills have used the court experience to shave the sharp edges off the bills and make them harder to challenge. Sorry, there's a siren going by. Let that go by. So in effect, what you now have is a model bill that's based on anti-BDS legislation, which has been tempered a little bit by the fires of courts to be harder to get at. And we're still waiting. One of the anti-BDS bills has been challenged to the Supreme Court at this point, and we don't know where that'll go. But more broadly, as we go forward with these anti-ESG bills in the next session, and so far the ones that have passed, the fossil fuel legislation, the guns and ammunition legislation, has largely passed in states that are, extremely red, have legislatures that are overwhelmingly red, governors that are red. There hasn't even been, if there might be protest, it wouldn't have been in those states. As this becomes more of a national campaign, I guess my question is, do you see it, as being something that will actually generate any kind of backlash, this anti-woke capitalism framing? And I don't know if this is something you're comfortable speaking on, but I wonder if what we've talked about in the two previous podcasts, the connection that anti-ESG forces are making to Israel to say that ESG, if it is applied to everyone, will capture Israel in its nets as well, and therefore it is anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. Therefore, all ESG and all woke capitalism, one of the problems with it is anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, and use that as a hook or a shield against any sort of partisan pushback. I don't know if that's something you want to speculate on, but I'd be very interested in how you see the path forward in states.
I haven't really thought about the last question. It's a very interesting question. I guess I need to think more about that in order to come up with an answer. I think, ALEC, again, really the members really fall in line on issues that are important to the organization. So I think we can expect, again, to see these bills introduced. And depending on how much of an issue it is made in the media, and I think there's been talk that we may see like hearings in the House, the U.S. House, if this stuff starts getting like live streamed on Fox News or something like that. I mean, that could definitely like fuel the fire in red states, right?
And I think it's worth noting that people like, the governor of Florida has made this one of his bread and butter issues. Mike Pence has made this a bread and butter issue. I believe Mike Pompeo has made it a bread and butter issue. So it's definitely elevated to higher levels in the political scheme of things.
Yeah, and Mike Pence, is the highest ranking politician ever to come out, ALEC. One time when he gave his speech there, he said, "I was for ALEC before it was cool." So he's a major champion, and he was at the meeting actually in this last meeting a few weeks ago, and was the featured speaker. So but yeah, I think we're going to see it now. There's some questions though. So we posted a piece recently based on a leaked membership list that was sent to us. That list showed that ALEC only had in early 2000 800 plus members. That is way far less than the quarter of all state lawmakers they claim to have. So there's a solid question as to whether they have as many members as they claim to. And you can throw in the fact that there was major turnover in the state houses during this election, and much of that turnover, was in red states. So are those red state, new lawmakers going to be ALEC members? Or are they going to be, people who are going to take up this issue or care about ESGs? It's really hard to predict, what new lawmakers are interested in or what they're going to do. So there's a lot of questions as to what will happen here. We also have in Kentucky, right, a legal challenge from the Kentucky Bankers Association, I believe, to the Kentucky bill which passed, which was based on the Energy Discrimination Elimination Act. So some lawmakers may look to that and say, hey, we might want to wait and see, what happens here before we pass this bill.
So I think it's really helpful. I need to look at that Kentucky case more closely. I was aware of it, but I haven't dug into it. I guess the last question I want to ask you, I said earlier, my Cassandra hat. I'm often Cassandra in these conversations. I will say that what I had raised the alarm about, 5 years ago is now coming to pass. My Cassandra abilities fail me right now when I try to imagine where this goes next in terms of ALEC's agenda, in terms of targeting the right to free speech, the right to protest, in terms of trying to use US laws, and particularly in states, and this idea of flexing the muscle of we are representing taxpayers to shut down speech that a given government doesn't like. Do you want to speculate on that a little bit? You can be my Cassandra for the sake of this conversation.
I will tell you that I don't think that with this issue are seeking to, eliminate free speech rights. Like, I don't think that they see it that way. I think that, the fossil fuel industry is asking them to move this bill, although we haven't made the connection yet. I do think it's the money's there somewhere. And a lot of the organizations that are involved receive a lot of dark money, right? So I mentioned Consumers Research, right? Heritage Action, America First Policy Institute, which is a new MAGA spinoff. They were there promoting it. Heartland Institute is a known climate denying organization supported by fossil fuel industry over many years. So there's a lot of like indirect ties. But I think this is more about this might be better described as the fossil fuel industry's like last war or last fight. They've kind of lost the climate, denialism, misinformation war. And so now this is it, really. Can they prevent climate divestment or not?
Almost win it on a technicality. If we can't win the battle, we'll win the fight on a technicality. I guess it's fascinating what you just said. They don't see this as a battle against free speech. And I agree. I mean, when I listen, it's often ironic to me when I listen to members of Congress making speeches about the sanctity of free speech. Those speeches are almost always coming from conservative Republicans who believe that the free speech of conservatives is being quashed on campus or beyond. Right. And it's quite extraordinary because those are almost always the same people who are at the forefront of trying to shut down free speech and protest on the things that they don't like. And particularly when it's things that touch on Israel, which is my beat. And when I made my prediction back in 2018, I actually made it for both sides of the political spectrum. If tomorrow you saw a state that has a Democratic legislature and a Democratic governor legislating that in order to get state contracts, you have to certify that you don't support whatever right-wing cause, you don't, give money to whatever right-wing cause, people would be up in arms. I mean, and hopefully the ACLU would also be up in arms because that would just be such a brazen violation of people's right to protest. It's a very myopic view of legislating if they don't see this as actually targeting free speech, because that is clearly impact.
ALEC actually, like, they consider themselves champions of free speech. They have a center for free speech, but all of it is spin. They've produced, legislation or model legislation, for like so-called campus free speech bills, which, seek to, create spaces for hate speech and, right-wing provocateurs on campus, and to, prevent counter speech or counter protests. At these things, so they find ways to sort of spin this, that they are champions, and this is obviously another example.
Yeah, well, obviously this is a conversation I would love to continue for much longer and go far afield of even the things we've been talking about today. I think we're going to end it here. I would like to put you on notice that I'm going to ask you to come back again, ideally for a webinar where we can have, a discussion amongst experts and I can just sit back and take notes. But thank you so much, David, for giving us so much of your time and expertise today. And I want to thank you for the work you do, because your research, and I mean, you're the kind of researcher who is just so transparent. You put out all your receipts, right, are out there for people to find and use for themselves. And it's just invaluable for anyone understanding what's actually happening. So thank you for that. I want to thank our audience today.
Lara.
Oh, you're sweet. For the audience, thank you for listening and for watching. And there will be lots of notes with this podcast for people who want to see receipts about all the things we've been talking about. Don't forget to follow David on Twitter. That's at @DUBOO. And his analysis is at exposedbycmd.org. And then what is the site for the ALEC Watch again?
It's alecexposed.org.
alecexposed.org. And finally, as always, I want to remind everyone to subscribe to the Occupied Thoughts podcast. You can do so on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Spotify. That way you won't miss any of the great content we're posting virtually every week. And you can find this podcast and a video of it on our website at www.fmep.org. And with that, we're going to end it here. I'm Lara Friedman, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, signing off until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts.